Rain fell in thin silver threads over a gas station that sat at the edge of nowhere, the kind of place travelers only noticed when their fuel gauge forced them to. The neon sign flickered twice before settling into a dull orange glow, and the pumps hummed with the tired rhythm of a town that rarely saw strangers after midnight. A single 18-wheeler rolled off the two-lane highway and eased toward the far pump, its headlights cutting long beams through the drizzle. Inside the cab sat a woman named Monica Hayes, 38 years old, her posture straight, her eyes calm, her hands steady on the wheel, even after 900 miles of driving. She killed the engine, sat for a moment in the quiet, and listened to the rain tap against the windshield like it was counting down to something. Nobody at that station had any reason to suspect she was anything other than what she appeared to be, a long-haul trucker passing through on her way to a delivery that did not exist. What none of them could see was the truth folded carefully beneath the surface of her ordinary life. Monica was not simply driving a truck. She was finishing the 11th month of an undercover operation for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a case that had taken her through 4 states, dozens of false names, and countless nights exactly like this one. Hidden inside her jacket was a microphone stitched into the seam, and clipped beneath the dashboard was a small camera angled just enough to catch anyone who approached her window. Her watch recorded audio. Her phone ran on an encrypted line straight to a field office 2 hours away. In a locked case behind her seat sat the real weight of her mission: a folder of surveillance photographs, financial records, and a federal warrant that had been building for the better part of a year. She stepped down from the cab into the rain, her boots hitting wet concrete, and walked toward the pump with the unhurried calm of someone who had learned that patience was often the sharpest tool available to her. She swiped her card, began fueling, and let her eyes drift across the empty lot, cataloging details out of habit rather than fear. A rusted pickup sat near the convenience store. A tired attendant leaned against the counter inside, half asleep under fluorescent light. Somewhere beyond the tree line, an owl called out once and went silent. Monica breathed in the wet night air, thinking of how close she was to the end of this assignment, and for a brief moment allowed herself to imagine driving home to a life that was entirely her own. She had grown up in a household where her father, a career police officer in a mid-sized city, taught her early that a badge was only as honest as the person wearing it. That lesson had followed her into the academy, then into her first years as a field agent, and eventually into the particular specialty she had built her career around, embedding herself for months at a time inside industries where corruption liked to hide in plain sight. Trucking routes, she had learned, made an almost perfect cover for both criminals and investigators alike. Long stretches of highway, offering countless opportunities for exchanges that never needed to happen, in daylight or in view of cameras that mattered. She had studied maps of this region for weeks before ever climbing into the cab of this particular truck, memorizing which roads saw unusual traffic patterns late at night, and which small departments seemed strangely reluctant to patrol them. Her supervisors back at the field office had warned her, more than once, that this particular assignment carried risks beyond the usual undercover work, since law enforcement corruption cases required an agent to move invisibly among people trained specifically to notice anything out of place. Monica had accepted the risk without hesitation, understanding that the harm caused by a corrupt department often outweighed the harm caused by ordinary criminals, since a badge lent legitimacy to whatever it chose to protect. She thought of that now, standing at the pump in the rain, aware that somewhere beyond this quiet gas station, a much larger machine had been grinding forward for months, waiting only for the right moment to reveal itself completely. That moment did not last. Headlights swept into the lot behind her, sharp and sudden, followed by the low crawl of a patrol cruiser easing to a stop only a few yards from her truck. A second cruiser followed, then a third, their light bars dark but their intentions unmistakable. Monica did not turn immediately. She finished securing the fuel nozzle first, moving with the same unhurried rhythm she always used, because she understood that the first reaction people had to authority often decided how the rest of the encounter would unfold. When she finally turned, 3 officers were already stepping out of their vehicles, boots crunching over wet gravel, flashlights snapping on in near unison. The man in front carried himself like someone who had never once been told no. His name, stitched above his badge, read Dalton, and the way his eyes moved over Monica before he even spoke told her everything she needed to know about how this was going to begin. Behind him walked two younger officers, one lean and nervous named Briggs, the other broad and silent named Nolan, both clearly following Dalton's lead rather than any protocol of their own. Dalton stopped a few feet from Monica, thumbs hooked into his belt, and let his flashlight travel slowly from her face down to her boots and back up again, as if he were inspecting livestock rather than speaking to a person. Dalton had run this small department for nearly 15 years, long enough that most residents of the town had stopped questioning the way he handled things, choosing instead the quiet comfort of assuming their sheriff knew best. He had built a reputation over those years, not through any particular skill at solving crimes, but through an instinct for controlling the narrative of every incident before anyone else had the chance to. Strangers passing through his jurisdiction, especially strangers who did not resemble the faces he was used to seeing, received a version of scrutiny that longtime residents rarely experienced. Monica understood this pattern the moment she saw the particular way his flashlight lingered on the out-of-state plates bolted to her trailer, and the way his gaze returned twice to the color of her skin before settling anywhere else on her appearance. "Routine inspection," Dalton said, his voice flat and unbothered, though nothing about his posture suggested routine was the actual reason he had pulled 3 units off patrol at this hour. Monica nodded once, calm, and asked what exactly he needed from her. Dalton ignored the question and instead began circling the truck, running his flashlight along the trailer doors, muttering something to Briggs about the vehicle looking out of place for the area. Monica watched him without expression, aware that his questions had nothing to do with safety inspections, and everything to do with a story he had already decided to tell himself about who she was and what she must be hiding. Within minutes, the questions turned personal, in a way no legitimate stop required. Dalton asked where she had come from, then asked again as though her first answer had not satisfied him. He asked how much cash she carried. He asked if there were any weapons in the cab. He asked, almost lazily, whether she had anything illegal back there, phrasing it less like a question and more like an accusation dressed up as curiosity. Monica answered each one with the same even tone, giving him nothing more than the truth required, offering no emotion he could use as an excuse. When he asked to see inside her cabin, she asked him plainly whether she was being legally detained, and the question landed on him like an insult he had not expected to receive from someone he assumed would simply comply. Dalton's jaw tightened, and for the first time something colder passed behind his eyes. He was used to people folding the moment a badge caught the streetlight, used to nervous hands and quick apologies, and Monica's steadiness unsettled him more than defiance ever could have. He stepped closer, close enough that Briggs shifted uncomfortably behind him, and told her that if she had nothing to hide, opening the cabin would take 30 seconds, and everyone could go their separate ways. Monica reminded him, without raising her voice, that he had no warrant and no probable cause, and that consent was hers, to give or withhold. The words did not sit well with him. A muscle in his neck flexed as though her calm was somehow more provoking than shouting would have been. He tried a different approach, softening his tone into something that pretended at friendliness while carrying the same threat underneath it. He mentioned, almost casually, that trucks like hers sometimes carried more than freight along this particular stretch of highway, and that a woman traveling alone this late at night might want to make things easy on herself. Monica recognized the tactic for what it was, an attempt to unsettle her into compliance through implication rather than direct accusation, and she answered only by asking again whether he intended to detain her formally or allow her to continue her route. Briggs shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable with the direction his superior had taken the conversation, while Nolan kept his eyes fixed somewhere on the middle distance, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze directly. The rain thickened slightly, drumming harder against the metal roof of the trailer, and somewhere behind them, the gas station attendant had stepped closer to the window, drawn by curiosity toward the small crowd forming outside. Dalton noticed the movement and clearly disliked having any additional witnesses, though he was far too committed to his position now to simply walk away without something to show for it. He asked Monica once more, this time more sharply, whether she understood what kind of trouble uncooperative attitudes could cause for a driver so far from home. Monica held his stare and answered simply that she understood her rights far better than he seemed to understand his obligations. A response that landed in the tense air between them like a struck match. By now, a few other travelers had noticed the gathering of patrol lights in the lot, and phones began rising from pockets, small red recording dots blinking to life in the rain. A woman filling her sedan 2 pumps down slowed her movements, watching. A man near the convenience store leaned against his car and lifted his phone as well, angling it toward the scene unfolding under the flickering station lights. None of them said a word, but their presence added a weight to the air that even Dalton could feel pressing against the back of his neck. Monica noticed them too, cataloging witnesses the way she had been trained to, though her expression never shifted from its careful neutrality. Dalton straightened his shoulders, glancing briefly at the gathering phones before deciding, in the stubborn way certain men decide things, that backing down now would look worse than pushing forward. He told Nolan to check the trailer locks, and Nolan hesitated only a moment before moving to obey, his flashlight trembling slightly against the metal doors. Monica's eyes tracked every movement without panic, her mind already several steps ahead of the men in front of her, calculating not what they might find, but what their actions would mean once this moment was reviewed by people with far more authority than a small-town sheriff. It was in that stretch of tension, while Dalton paced and Nolan fumbled with the trailer latch, that Monica noticed something the others did not. A white pickup truck eased along the road bordering the station, slowing just enough to be noticed by someone trained to notice such things, then continuing on without stopping. She recognized the vehicle instantly, its dented rear panel and mismatched tire, a detail burned into memory from surveillance photographs she had studied for months. It belonged to a man under active federal investigation, a courier tied directly to the trafficking network she had spent nearly a year trying to unravel. And Dalton, standing only a few feet away, glanced toward that same truck for exactly 1 second, before looking away with the practiced ease of a man who did not want to be seen looking at all. That single second told Monica more than 11 months of surveillance files ever could. It confirmed what her instincts had whispered for weeks, but her evidence had not yet proven that Dalton was not simply a small-town sheriff drunk on petty authority, but a man tangled inside the very network she had been sent to dismantle. His performance of suspicion toward her was not random prejudice alone. It was a cover, a way to keep attention fixed on her, long enough for that pickup truck to pass through unnoticed. Understanding settled over her with a cold clarity, and for the first time that night, her calm was no longer simply professional restraint. It was strategy sharpening into focus. Dalton returned his attention to her, apparently satisfied that the pickup had cleared the area, and resumed his questioning with renewed impatience, as though buying time had been his only true objective all along. He gestured toward the cabin again, his tone hardening, telling her that continued refusal would only make things more difficult for herself. Monica held his gaze without blinking, aware now that every second she kept him occupied here was a second that mattered far beyond this gas station. Beneath her jacket, her fingers moved carefully, discreetly triggering the small device stitched into her sleeve, sending a silent signal outward into the night. A location, a status, a single word that would set an entire team into motion. Miles away, in a nondescript building with darkened windows, that signal arrived on a monitor manned by agents who had been waiting for exactly this moment for 11 long months. Screens lit up, phones were lifted, and within seconds, a coordinated response began moving through the rain toward the small town Monica currently stood in. None of this was visible to anyone at the gas station. To Dalton, to Briggs, to Nolan, to the onlookers with their raised phones, nothing had changed at all. The woman in front of them remained exactly as she had been, quiet, composed, seemingly powerless against 3 armed officers determined to have their way. But somewhere on a dark highway, black vehicles were already beginning to move. Dalton's patience, thin to begin with, finally broke entirely. He turned to Briggs and ordered him to search the cabin, whether Monica consented or not, declaring loudly that suspicious behavior alone gave him all the justification he needed. Briggs hesitated, glancing uneasily toward the small crowd of raised phones, but obeyed anyway, climbing up toward the driver's door, while Nolan continued working uselessly at the trailer latch. Monica said nothing to stop him, her silence deliberate rather than defeated, because she understood that every unlawful action Dalton authorized tonight was another nail sealed into a case that had taken almost a year to build. She simply watched, memorizing each violation as it occurred. It was Dalton himself who found the locked case tucked behind the driver's seat, his flashlight catching the dull gleam of its metal clasp. He pulled it free with obvious satisfaction, certain he had finally uncovered whatever criminal secret justified his suspicion from the start. When it would not open easily, he did not hesitate before breaking the lock, prying it apart with a tire iron, while Briggs and Nolan watched, their nerves fraying with anticipation. The onlookers with their phones leaned in closer, sensing that whatever happened next would be the moment worth remembering. Monica stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable, waiting for the truth to do what it always eventually did. The lock gave way, and Dalton threw the case open with the flourish of a man expecting to be proven right. Instead of narcotics, instead of stacks of cash, instead of anything resembling the story he had built in his mind, he found folders, surveillance photographs, financial documents, federal letterhead, and resting on top of it all, a badge that caught the gas station light and reflected it back into his stunned face. The lot fell into a silence so complete that even the rain seemed to soften. Dalton stared down at what he was holding, his mouth opening slightly, no words arriving to fill the space where his confidence had been only seconds before. Briggs leaned forward to look, his flashlight beam trembling slightly as it passed over the photographs scattered across the top of the file, several of which showed images of the very pickup truck that had passed through the lot only minutes earlier. Nolan took an involuntary step back, as though putting distance between himself and the case might somehow undo what his eyes had already seen. The onlookers who had been recording from a respectful distance drew closer now, sensing without needing to be told that whatever was happening in front of them had shifted into something far more significant than a routine traffic stop. Even the rain, still falling steadily, seemed to fade into the background of a moment that none of them would forget for a long time. Monica let the silence stretch for a beat, longer than necessary, not out of cruelty, but because she understood the value of allowing a moment like this to fully land before she spoke another word. She watched Dalton's hands shake almost imperceptibly around the edges of the case, watched the color drain slowly from his face as understanding replaced arrogance, and only then did she step forward to reclaim what belonged to her. Monica stepped forward then, and for the first time that night, her voice carried a different weight entirely, steady but unmistakably commanding. She told him plainly who she was, that she was a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and that everything occurring in this parking lot over the last several minutes had been recorded from multiple angles. Briggs took a step backward instinctively, his face draining of color. Nolan's hand dropped away from the trailer latch entirely, his mouth slightly open. Dalton said nothing at first, the case still open in his trembling hands, the badge inside it seeming heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. He tried, eventually, to recover some version of authority, insisting that he had simply been doing his job, that nothing about tonight had been personal, that he could not have known who she truly was. Monica listened to his justification without interrupting, then calmly reminded him that intention meant very little when actions were the ones being measured. She listed them without raising her voice. An unlawful detention lacking probable cause, a forced search without warrant or consent, the destruction of federal property in the form of a broken lock, and every moment of it captured not only by her own hidden devices, but by the bystanders whose phones had never stopped recording. Dalton's face shifted through disbelief, then anger, then something closer to fear as the reality of his situation settled fully into place. He attempted one final gambit, his voice rising slightly as he suggested that whatever she believed she had witnessed him doing could easily be explained away once cooler heads were involved, that a sheriff with 15 years of service deserved the benefit of the doubt that a stranger passing through his town did not. Monica allowed herself the smallest shift in expression then, not quite a smile, but something close enough to unsettle him further. She told him that benefit of the doubt was precisely the currency he had spent freely on strangers for years, without ever extending it in return, and that tonight, for the first time, The doubt belonged entirely to him. Briggs, standing slightly apart from his superior now, said nothing at all. His silence itself, a kind of answer to questions no one had yet asked him directly. It was at that moment that headlights swept into the lot from the highway. Not one vehicle, but several. Black SUVs, moving with the disciplined precision of a team that had trained for exactly this kind of arrival. Doors opened before the vehicles had even fully stopped, and federal agents stepped out into the rain, moving with calm urgency toward the scene. Dalton's hands fell slightly, the broken case slipping from his grip, its contents scattering slightly across the wet pavement. Briggs raised both hands without being asked. Nolan simply stood frozen, staring at the badges now surrounding him from every direction. What none of the men standing in that parking lot yet understood was how much larger this moment truly was. Monica's presence at this particular gas station on this particular night had never been an accident. For nearly a year, the Bureau had tracked a courier network moving through this region, one that relied heavily on local law enforcement, looking away at precisely the right moments. Dalton's name had surfaced early in that investigation, first as a minor inconsistency in a report, then as a pattern of unexplained absences during key transport windows, and eventually as a direct financial trail linking him to payments he could never adequately explain. Tonight had never been a routine inspection gone wrong. It had been the final test in an operation built to confirm what evidence alone could not fully prove: that Dalton would abuse his authority the moment he believed no one capable of stopping him was watching. Every choice he made in that parking lot had only tightened the case against him further. His illegal search had violated federal protections. His interference with an active undercover operation constituted obstruction at the highest level. His willingness to break federal property without hesitation demonstrated exactly the kind of unchecked authority the investigation had been built to expose. And all of it, every second, had been captured cleanly enough to withstand any courtroom challenge his lawyers might eventually attempt to raise. The agents moving through the lot were not there merely to arrest one corrupt sheriff. They were there to begin unraveling everything connected to him. Within the hour, additional teams were already en route to Dalton's office, his home, and the modest bank accounts that had somehow accumulated far more than his salary could explain. Agents moved through his files with methodical patience, uncovering records of payments disguised as consulting fees, timestamps that lined up precisely with known trafficking movements through the region, and communications that made his involvement impossible to deny. Briggs, shaken and desperate to separate himself from what Dalton had built, began cooperating almost immediately, offering details about patrol schedules that had conveniently avoided certain roads on certain nights. Nolan, quieter by nature, answered every question asked of him, his voice trembling but honest, clearly relieved to finally be free of a silence he had carried far longer than he wanted to admit. Dalton was placed in handcuffs there in the gas station parking lot, the same lot where he had spent the last half hour trying to strip away Monica's dignity under the guise of routine procedure. The irony was not lost on anyone watching, least of all the small crowd of bystanders who had captured the entire exchange from its opening moments. Their footage, uploaded and shared long after the fact, would eventually become part of the public record, supporting a case far larger than any of them realized they were witnessing. Dalton said nothing as he was led toward one of the black vehicles, his earlier bravado replaced entirely by the stunned silence of a man watching his own downfall unfold in real time. Monica did not gloat. She did not raise her voice in triumph, or allow herself even a small smile of vindication as Dalton was placed into the vehicle. She simply stepped back, arms crossed loosely, watching the operation she had spent nearly a year building finally reach its conclusion, with the same quiet professionalism she had carried since climbing down from her truck that night. For her, this was never about proving a point to a man who had underestimated her. It was about closing a case that had taken lives, ruined communities, and thrived precisely because men like Dalton believed themselves untouchable inside the borders of their own small authority. In the weeks that followed, the story spread far beyond the boundaries of the small town where it began. National outlets picked up the footage, first the bystander recordings, then the official Bureau statement confirming the existence and success of the operation. Former victims of Dalton's department, people who had spent years too frightened to speak against a sheriff who controlled every corner of local law enforcement, began coming forward one by one. Stories emerged of ignored complaints, buried evidence, and selective enforcement that had allowed a trafficking network to operate for years beneath the surface of an otherwise quiet town. Each new testimony added another thread to a case that had already been strong enough to convict, but now carried the undeniable weight of a community finally finding its voice. Analysts and commentators spent considerable time dissecting the footage from that rainy parking lot, many of them noting how ordinary the encounter had looked in its opening minutes, indistinguishable from countless similar stops that occurred across the country without ever making headlines. What made this particular night different, they argued, was not the behavior of the officers involved, which followed a pattern many viewers recognized instantly and painfully, but rather the outcome, a rare instance where the person being treated with suspicion held more power in that moment than the man attempting to intimidate her. Legal scholars pointed to the footage as a valuable teaching example, illustrating with unusual clarity how quickly a routine stop could slide into unlawful territory once an officer decided, consciously or not, that a person's appearance alone justified escalating suspicion. The clip circulated widely enough that several state legislatures cited it directly during hearings on law enforcement accountability measures introduced in the months that followed. Monica declined most interview requests that came her way in the aftermath, preferring to let the case file and the courtroom testimony speak for themselves, rather than positioning herself as any kind of public figure. The few reporters who did manage brief conversations with her found someone notably uninterested in discussing herself, redirecting most questions back toward the broader pattern of corruption the case had exposed and the reforms she hoped might follow from it. She spoke, when pressed, about the importance of accountability structures that did not rely solely on communities finding the courage to speak up after years of silence, arguing that systems should be built to catch misconduct long before it required an undercover operation and a locked case to finally bring it into the light. The investigation expanded well beyond Dalton himself, reaching into connections he had built over years of quiet corruption. Financial records revealed a chain of payments stretching through 3 counties tied to distributors who had relied on protected routes and warned patrols to move their product safely for longer than anyone outside the network had ever suspected. Arrests followed in neighboring jurisdictions as the full scope of the operation became clear, each new development, another piece falling into place around the framework Monica's undercover work had first exposed. What had once been dismissed by some as an isolated case of a difficult sheriff became recognized instead as the unraveling of a regional network that had done significant harm for a very long time. Agents traced the driver of the white pickup truck within 2 days, following the trail Monica had first flagged from the gas station parking lot. His name was Russell Combs, a courier who had spent nearly 3 years moving product along routes that Dalton's department had quietly kept clear of scrutiny in exchange for a cut of every shipment that passed through safely. Combs, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of decades behind bars, began cooperating within hours of his arrest, naming suppliers further up the chain and confirming details about Dalton's involvement that even Monica's own surveillance had not fully captured. Each new piece of testimony strengthened a case that had already been formidable, transforming what began as a single corrupt sheriff into the collapse of an operation spanning far beyond anything the town itself could have imagined. Prosecutors working alongside the Bureau spent weeks organizing the evidence into a case built to withstand every challenge a skilled defense might attempt to raise. They cross-referenced patrol logs against known transport windows, financial deposits against unexplained gaps in departmental budgets, and radio communications against the movements of vehicles later confirmed to be carrying illegal product. The picture that emerged was damning in its thoroughness, showing not an occasional lapse in judgment, but a sustained and deliberate pattern stretching back years. Even Dalton's own attorney, reviewing the mounting evidence privately, reportedly advised him that no jury presented with this volume of documentation would find room for reasonable doubt. Monica herself returned briefly to headquarters, where her handling of the case earned quiet but sincere recognition from those who understood exactly how much restraint her performance that night had required. A senior agent reviewing her footage remarked that most people, faced with the treatment she endured in that parking lot, would have reacted with anger long before the truth ever had a chance to surface. Monica's ability to remain composed under provocation, he noted, was not simply a personal trait. It was the very reason the operation succeeded as cleanly as it did, giving prosecutors airtight footage instead of a chaotic confrontation that skilled defense attorneys could later twist into doubt. A journalist eventually secured a brief interview with her, though Monica kept her answers measured, offering little more than what the case itself required. When asked directly how she managed to stay calm, while 3 armed officers treated her with open suspicion and contempt, she considered the question for a moment before answering honestly. She explained that losing her composure in that moment would have given them exactly what they needed, a story about an angry woman, rather than a professional doing her job under unjust scrutiny. By remaining calm, she said, she ensured that when people eventually watched the footage, they would see the truth clearly, without her own emotion clouding what had actually happened. The journalist pressed further, asking whether she had ever doubted her ability to see the operation through under such personal pressure. Monica shook her head slightly, explaining that doubt was a luxury she had learned to set aside the moment she accepted this line of work. She had trained for years to separate the person from the mission, understanding that every undercover operation demanded a version of patience most people never had to test in their daily lives. The badge in that locked case, she added quietly, had never been the true weapon that night. Her patience had been. Before ending the interview, the journalist asked one final question, wondering aloud whether Monica ever worried that cases like this one, however successful, changed very little in the larger picture, since corruption of this kind tended to resurface in new forms even after individual men were removed from power. Monica considered the question carefully before answering, telling him that she had learned not to measure her work by whether corruption disappeared entirely, since that expectation would leave any honest person perpetually disappointed. Instead, she measured it by whether the specific harm in front of her stopped, whether the specific people trapped beneath a specific corrupt system finally found relief, even if the larger fight continued somewhere else entirely. It was, she admitted, a smaller kind of victory than people often expected from stories like hers, but it was the only kind that had ever proven sustainable across a career built on patience rather than spectacle. Back at the field office, her handling of the case became something of a quiet reference point for newer agents entering the same specialized work, cited in training sessions as an example of what disciplined restraint could accomplish when paired with thorough preparation. Supervisors noted that the strength of the case had rested almost entirely on Monica's refusal to let the encounter become anything other than exactly what it needed to be. A documented record of misconduct, clean enough to withstand any courtroom challenge. Younger agents, some of them still adjusting to the psychological toll of long-term undercover assignments, found reassurance in her example, proof that composure under provocation was a skill that could be built deliberately rather than a trait some people simply possessed by nature. Monica herself never framed her conduct that night as anything extraordinary, insisting instead that she had simply done what the job required of her, nothing more and nothing less. As the case moved toward formal prosecution, evidence continued mounting against Dalton with a thoroughness that left little room for the kind of legal maneuvering he might once have relied upon. Prosecutors built their case not only around the events of that single night, but around months of documented corruption that painted a clear and damning portrait of a man who had weaponized his position for personal gain. Briggs, having cooperated extensively, received a reduced charge in exchange for his testimony, a decision that further strengthened the case against the man he had once followed without question. Nolan, similarly cooperative, expressed something closer to genuine remorse, admitting in one interview that he had long suspected something wrong, but had lacked the courage to speak until circumstances forced his hand. The town itself changed in the aftermath, slowly and imperfectly, the way most places do after uncovering a truth they had spent years avoiding. New leadership eventually took over the local department, promising reforms that many residents watched with cautious hope rather than immediate trust. Some spoke openly for the first time about incidents they had witnessed but never reported, encouraged by the knowledge that silence had allowed corruption to persist far longer than it should have. Others simply expressed quiet relief that the man who had controlled so much of their daily lives through fear no longer held that power. Change did not arrive instantly, but it arrived, carried forward by the same kind of persistence Monica had shown from the very beginning. When the trial finally began, the courtroom filled with faces that had waited years for this exact moment, some familiar to Dalton from decades of small-town encounters, others strangers who had traveled simply to witness the outcome of a case that had dominated headlines for months. Prosecutors laid out the timeline methodically, beginning with the gas station footage that had first cracked the case open and moving steadily backward through years of documented corruption that painted an unmistakable portrait of a man who had turned his badge into a weapon for personal profit. Defense attorneys attempted several times to challenge the legality of the undercover operation itself, suggesting that Monica's methods had somehow entrapped their client into behavior he would not otherwise have exhibited. The argument gained no traction, undone entirely by the simple fact that Dalton's pattern of misconduct predated her arrival by years, documented independently through financial records that had nothing to do with the night at the gas station at all. An elderly woman named Ruth Callahan testified on the third day of the trial, her voice steady despite the weight of what she had carried silently for nearly a decade. She described a night years earlier, when Dalton had pulled her nephew over on a similarly flimsy pretext, planting doubt where none belonged and threatening consequences that never should have been on the table. She had never reported the incident, she admitted, because she had not believed anyone would take her word over a sheriff's, a sentiment that rippled through the courtroom with quiet, painful recognition from others who understood exactly what she meant. Her testimony, along with several others like it, transformed the trial from a simple corruption case into something the community itself seemed to be reckoning with in real time, a slow and difficult acknowledgement of how long silence had been mistaken for peace. Monica did not linger in the town long enough to witness every consequence of that single night unfold. Her work, as it always did once a case reached its conclusion, moved her elsewhere, toward another assignment that would require the same discipline and patience she had carried into this one. Before leaving, she requested no recognition beyond what the case itself naturally earned her. Uninterested in public acknowledgement for work, she considered simply an extension of duty rather than personal achievement. She understood, perhaps more clearly than most, that justice rarely announced itself with fanfare. More often, it arrived quietly, built patiently over months of unseen effort, until a single moment finally allowed the truth to surface. On the morning she left, the sky had cleared into a pale gold that stretched wide over the highway, stretching beyond the town's edge. Monica climbed back into her truck, the same vehicle that had carried both her cover and her mission through nearly a year of careful deception, and started the engine one final time in that region. She did not look back toward the gas station where everything had unraveled, nor toward the courthouse where Dalton's future was now being decided by people far beyond his control. Her focus, as always, remained forward, toward whatever assignment waited next, in a career built entirely around disappearing into ordinary lives, long enough to expose extraordinary wrongs. As the truck pulled onto the open road, the small town faded slowly into her mirrors, its rooftops catching the early light before disappearing behind a bend lined with trees. There was no triumphant music playing in her mind, no speech rehearsed for cameras that would never follow her here. There was only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that a man who had abused his power for years would finally answer for it, and that the people he had frightened into silence could now speak without fear, hanging over every word. Monica had never needed applause to know her work mattered. She had only ever needed the truth to survive contact with the world, and on this particular morning it finally had. Somewhere behind her, case files continued moving through federal offices, witnesses continued coming forward, and a network that had operated in the shadows for years continued crumbling, piece by piece, under the weight of evidence she had spent nearly a year gathering. None of it required her presence any longer. The mission that had begun with a locked case hidden behind her seat had reached its conclusion not through confrontation or vengeance, but through patience, allowed to run its full course. Justice, as Monica understood it, was rarely loud. It simply waited, steady and unwavering, until the truth finally had nowhere left to hide. She thought, as the highway carried her further from the town, about all the people who had approached her that night with certainty painted across their faces, certain of who she must be and what she must be hiding, simply because of how she looked sitting behind the wheel of a truck at midnight. None of them had bothered to ask a single honest question before deciding her guilt, and she wondered how many other people across the country faced that same swift, unearned judgment every single day without ever having a locked case behind their seat to prove otherwise. That thought settled into her quietly rather than bitterly, becoming less a source of anger and more a reminder of exactly why the work she did mattered, even when it demanded months of her life disappearing into a role built entirely around being underestimated. Her phone buzzed once with a message from her supervisor, confirming her next assignment would begin in 3 weeks, granting her a small window of rest before the cycle began again in some other town, under some other name, behind the wheel of some other vehicle, chosen to blend seamlessly into wherever she needed to disappear. Monica allowed herself a small, genuine smile at that, the first unguarded expression she had permitted herself in longer than she could easily remember. 3 weeks was not much, but it was enough to remember who she was, outside the roles she wore so convincingly, enough to call her mother, sit in her own apartment, and sleep without the constant low hum of vigilance that undercover work demanded of her nervous system every waking hour. The road stretched ahead of her, empty and quiet in the early light, carrying her toward whatever came next. Behind her lay a town slowly learning to trust its own institutions again, a sheriff facing consequences long overdue, and a community beginning to understand that silence had never truly protected them the way fear once convinced them it had. Ahead of her lay simply the highway, endless and familiar, the same kind of road she had traveled countless times before in service of work most people would never fully understand. Monica Hayes drove on, calm as she had always been, carrying with her not triumph, but the quiet certainty that the truth, once given enough patience, always found its way into the light.